Welcome to Brain Ponderings, your unfiltered window into the world of brain research, neuroscience research, and conversations with experts in their particular area of neuroscience. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Jordan Grafman. He's a neuropsychologist and professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation in the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago, the medical school there. And he's also director of the brain injury research at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, I understand, and also chief of the Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory. And Jordan has, throughout his career, he's had a strong interest in research how brain injuries, brain lesions, particularly localized brain injuries where you have only a small part of the brain injured, and then he's looked at how that affects behavior and emotions, and he's combined that with brain imaging and other methods for, um, I guess, having the subjects do tasks while he's doing brain imaging and so forth. So welcome, Jordan.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And today, so Jordan's going to talk about brain injury somewhat, but in the context of using these brain lesions, individuals with brain lesions as a tool uh, to study religious beliefs. And in general, he's done a lot of work beginning when he was at NIH for a while and continuing on trying to understand the neural networks that seem to be involved in processing of religious beliefs like in supernatural agent, gods, and so forth. And and that's important that from the standpoint, is there something unique about religious beliefs, or do they overlap or have similarities with other belief systems? Um, can you talk a little bit about your background, Jordan? How you got interested in, well, your neuropsychology. I understand you, where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Chicago.
Cubs fan.
Yes. Grew up in Chicago and then left for many years and was happy to return to my hometown about a decade or more ago.
And you, in the interim, so you went to the West Coast for undergraduate, and then you were at University of Wisconsin-Madison for your PhD.
That's right. That's right. When I was in California, I was actually had a major in geology,
Oh,
and I took a course, an elective course on sleep and dreams and the brain. And it just, it's one of those experiences where it just wraps around you and won't let go. And I decided to change my major from geology and desert studies to brain research. And I was not at the best university for brain research or for psychology even at the time, but I was able to eventually go to as you pointed out, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. When I was there, uh, I was able to write my own program because they didn't have a PhD in neuropsychology at the time.
huh.
Graduate school accepted me doing that, which was kind of
Interesting.
nice.
Wow.
But because I wasn't officially in a single department, I had to figure out a way to pay for my education. And so the what seemed like a reasonable way at the time was to join the military. So the I joined the U.S. Air Force, and they gave me a health professions scholarship that enabled me to go through graduate school and really not owe anything at the end. They
Oh,
really paid everything.
interesting.
So I get my PhD at Wisconsin. I'm ready to go into the military. I had a letter from them, which I would advise anybody who's considering going into the military to get their promises in writing,
Mhm.
which said I was going to be assigned to a neuropsychology lab, presumably at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It turns out They didn't want to do that. They wanted to put me in a missile silo up in the Dakotas because people there were under a great deal of stress and they needed psychologists. So I had to explain to them, this is not my training. I'm not a therapist or
Right.
a clinician really. Even though I had a lot of clinical training, I wanted to be a researcher. And so eventually they said, well, find yourself a place in the federal government somewhere. And so I found at the time that the Vietnam head injury study was starting at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. And I got the Air Force Surgeon General at the time, Paul Myers, to assign me there through a lot of conversations with other people. So I got assigned to it, and I began to study Vietnam veterans who had suffered penetrating brain injuries. Now, penetrating brain injuries usually are by low velocity shell fragments if somebody survived, usually an explosive device, but not always. Uh, so we had these vets, and their lesions from the penetrating brain injuries were different than other brain lesions in the sense that, for the most part, they sort of looked like if you had shoved an ice cream cone into your brain with the top part of the cone on the surface. And
Uh,
as you got deeper, uh, it was smaller and smaller until the point of the ice cream cone. That's sort of what those lesions tended to look like if they were a little bit larger. So they were very defined and a great way to study the causal nature of brain regions upon behavior changes. So I was very lucky. I started studying it. At the time, I was interested in math and calculation in the brain. And about two-thirds of the way through the study, I began to get letters from spouses, usually spouses, sometimes parents, saying, "Thank you. We really appreciate how you helped our son." They were all males, uh, and but you missed something. I'm starting to get, I'm nervous, right? Because it's the early part of my career. What did I miss? And basically, what they were saying is we didn't assess very well their social behavior.
mm,
We didn't really get at it, even though I was interested in the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes of the brain at the time, the area of the brain that I believe makes us most human,
yeah.
is most characteristic of the kinds of things we attribute to the brain that have to do with higher level functions, but that includes social behavior. And at the time when we were starting this out, there weren't a lot of good clinical tests, for example, to study social behavior in brain injured patients. And so as that study, as that phase of the study ended, and I was going to the NIH, I became interested in all the kinds of social behaviors that we have uh, that might be stored
Mm,
in the prefrontal cortex, represented there. They're very primitive social behaviors that we don't need the prefrontal cortex for. But for more complex social behaviors, we absolutely do need that area of the brain. Okay. So I had, for a long time, and as you can see from here, been a Chicago Cubs fan. And a Chicago Cubs fan has to have a belief that next year will be better somehow. And besides being, as I argued in a chapter I wrote about the social behavior of Cub fans, comparing them mostly to New York fans, uh, it became pretty clear how important these social narratives were to your own identity and character. And
okay.
so we began to study political and economic beliefs as a way of understanding what might be stored in the brain and how we use those beliefs for everyday behavior, what we do every day in the community, with friends, and how we think about ourselves and how we present ourselves to others. Uh, Clearly has a lot to do with what we believe in. What are our principles? Okay. So we began to do those studies, and got some interesting results. We began to get published, and we began to argue what parts of the prefrontal cortex might be important for different aspects of social beliefs and other social behaviors. And things were sort of rolling along in that direction. And all of a sudden, I had an application from a physician from Greece, a neurologist who Mark knows,
Yeah.
and he came and he was very interested in expanding our research into the realm of religious belief. Now, up until then, and certainly even now, there are very few cognitive neuroscientists, people interested in behavior and brain, who actually study religion.
Yeah.
There are a whole bunch of people who are simply psychologists interested in psychological behaviors as they relate to religious belief, anthropologists, philosophers. So it's not that the field was not large. It was just that nobody was focusing on the brain
Yeah.
and religion. Maybe a few people, handful, really. Some people were very interested in meditation, in sort of behavioral states.
Yeah.
That was not so much my interest. My interest was in the social manifestations of religious belief, what it meant for us in our social behaviors, and how we could fractionate, decompose religion into its various components and try to study the components independently and then in combination. Okay. So the fellow and myself and some of the other members of my lab decided to plunge in, and we studied healthy volunteers from the era to begin with using functional neuroimaging. And in those studies, we began to see that at least certain aspects of religious belief were co-opting, that is, utilizing brain networks and regions that were used for other social purposes. So, for example, if you would ask somebody what they believe or think about God, conception of God in their minds, we were interested in trying to understand, well, what brain areas were important for that. And it turns out that the same brain areas we use to better understand somebody else's intentions, like a friend, a spouse, a child, a parent,
Oh,
why did they have that kind of behavior?
yeah.
What, and we have to think about why to better understand our relationships with them and what they're doing. Well, we saw that the same areas were concerned when we asked people to think about God. So that got that. So the first study we did was a study looking at functional brain activity and people endorsing statements about religious belief.
So this brain circuit, is this, you're talking about the theory of mind
That's right.
concept? Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So some of the same regions that were involved in theory of mind as we would use them to better understand a friend, say, or even somebody we don't know. Why did they behave like that? Well, those are the same processes we use to understand why God behaved in a certain way.
Yeah. And, I had one of my first podcasts I had on this series several years ago was on on bird brains, specifically crows and other corvids, and how this evidence that there's actually really good evidence that they can think about what another bird is thinking and change their behavior based on, what they think that other bird is going to do in the future. So this is something that it's conserved somewhat anyway during evolution, and it's in humans, it's really refined and I guess you'd say, yeah, more sophisticated.
That's right. There are different levels of that, though, aren't there?
Yeah,
Sometimes we want to predict somebody's next movement, say, or action,
yeah,
but often we want to use it to better understand what's in the mind of that other person
Yeah.
and how they're thinking. And clearly, this is something we use when we don't know somebody as well, or even if the entity is a supernatural agent, which is another way to describe God or an angel or some sort of character that's above and beyond the people that we would meet in everyday life, right?
Yeah.
And for if you're an atheist, it could be somebody, it could be an entity that you might consider a fictional character,
Yeah.
doesn't really exist. We created a narrative because we needed that narrative for various social reasons. Or, or if you're a believer, you could say that I believe that there's a God, and for me to understand God, I have to see how people in the past described and understood God,
Yeah.
and then I can help, that will help me make my own judgments about God, because if I have a personal God, then I'm relating to that God in some way. And I want to understand if there are actions that I attribute to God, I want to understand why those actions took place. And I have to put myself in God's mind to some degree to do that. So it doesn't matter if you're an atheist or a believer.
And with religions, clearly there's and any group identification, whether it's religion, a political party, or other things, your early life environment has a big, and your parents have and your the people you interact with in your social networks early in life have a big influence on, your belief system throughout your life.
That's
And
true.
you're going to go through a lot of the imaging studies and so on and get to the lesion studies, which are really interesting, trying to map out uh, maybe there's some specific regions where anytime a person is having a religious experience or thoughts, they kind of map onto certain regions and so on. Um, but and I guess maybe at the end of the talk maybe we can go back and forth on you know, what are there structural correlates at the synaptic level or, the fine circuitry that maybe correlated with the functional changes you see? Um, just quickly on that, you mentioned anthropologists and, the purpose of clearly been a major adaptive value of religious beliefs in human evolution. And I've been interested in brain evolution from different standpoint, from the standpoint of what was the major driver, food scarcity maybe is a major one, being able to figure out how to compete for limited food resources. And then, of course, we don't have a written record uh, that goes back far enough in human evolution. But one thing that happened was the agricultural revolution when you got where and the following centuries or whatever, uh, the number of people in groups increased dramatically, and then you get villages and eventually countries, and so when there's that big a group, it's cohesion becomes really important, and so there's this idea that religions evolved to kind of facilitate group cohesion and cooperation among many people in large groups.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Mark. I would say probably though above and beyond that,
Okay.
right? How do you enforce those behaviors? I
Uh,
think that's a piece. So you could sort of argue that uh, there were many potential leaders in a social group, and some of these leaders had their own ideas about how to organize and run a social group, say, to make sure everybody is cooperative in some way, either cooperative towards the leaders and the leaders gets the booty, so to speak, or it's shared among the community in such a way that there's no uprising and people aren't killing each other over the assets of the community. So how do you do that? Well, one way anyway, one way, and it seems to have been a fairly successful way, is saying there's something that's more powerful than the people you know.
Hmm.
And this powerful entity, this supernatural agent plus agents, right? In many prior to the
Yeah.
sort of the big three religions, say, or big four religions, prior to those, uh, there were pagan religions, right? Where you had sort of a god for any occasion, so to
Yeah.
speak, right? To help explain things. And if you could use a god to explain these things, because you couldn't use other humans, and you didn't have science to help you understand,
Yeah.
for example, why there might be a volcano, right? Why a volcano erupted and buried a community and so forth. If you didn't have that, you wanted to make an attribution to some higher order
Yeah.
of power. And if you did that, and then at the same time figured out, well, the kinds of things I want, how I want people to behave in my community. If I just say it, okay, maybe people respect me, they might follow it. But if the God says it, they better follow it. And why? Because we don't want to really die. We don't like to die. So that we can sort of construct what might happen in a world if there's a God, in a world after we die. So if you behave well in accordance with the rules that these gods, either by example in the case of many pagan societies, but if not by example, at least what is pronounced in some way and conveyed to humans, if that is something that's really important, we better behave because we don't want to go to the wrong part of the afterlife, right? We don't want that to happen. So many people, particularly because there was no widespread education, there very few people learned to read or even interpret graphic art on caves. I mean, these things were very limited. So you might argue in the very beginnings, people were ignorant,
Yeah.
right? And as they evolved, I would argue, that evolution occurred in conjunction with the evolution of the prefrontal cortex in humans, the frontal lobes.
Yeah.
And so that evolution allowed us to have these sort of elaborated conceptualizations and appreciations of religious belief structures. And with that understanding, allowed us to behave somewhat better. Not obviously not completely better. We still kill each other. We still have a lot of primitive impulses that are followed. But in general, it was an improvement over what was prior to this
Well,
establishment.
improvement within the in group, but not to
Ah,
out groups.
that's right. That's exactly right. And we still have those in-group and out-group sort of uh, behaviors that some of them are implicit, right? They're in the brain. They cause us to at least initially reject others if they're in the out group
Yeah.
and favor our in group. And this is shown in economic studies and social studies. And this is something always important to mention, that is in the naive situation where the outgroup is sort of not somebody you know, just somebody, a figure out there, but they're defined as being in the outgroup in some way.
Yeah.
But if you get to know somebody a little bit and you get to understand them and fraternize with them, the prejudice diminishes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it diminishes even further if you take their position, if it's some sort of a game challenge where now you're in their role and you understand their point of view better. Doesn't eliminate prejudice, but it helps quite a bit.
Okay, so how do you, when you interact with a White Sox fan, is there any issues?
I hate them. No. No, I grew up on the north side of Chicago, so I have a different issue. Since you brought up baseball, since you brought up baseball here, I can tell you that early on I was a White Sox fan when I was in,
Oh,
very young, because the Cubs stunk. I mean, they were so bad. You just really didn't want to go to Wrigley Field.
yeah,
It was a
yeah,
great, it's a great baseball park. So I used to take the L down to Comiskey Park occasionally. And there was a baseball player for the White Sox. You'd have to be pretty old to remember this guy. Louis Aparicio
yeah.
was a shortstop. He eventually played for the Orioles, I think.
Yeah,
But
I'm old enough.
okay, he was to my mind, he was great. He was a great fielder. He had a pretty good batting average, and he stole a lot of bases. And so the White Sox used to have the idea of go Sox. That was their sort of that was what you when you
That was the same. So I grew up in Minnesota, Jordan. And
okay.
so I was a Twins fan. So I think that was the same time like the Twins had Cesar Tovar and Tony Oliva and
That
Harmon
was a
Killem.
little bit after
Was
this.
it after that?
Yeah. But
Okay.
here's why I changed. So I was so taken by Louis Aparicio, I wrote a poem. And so at a game in Comiskey Park, I went down I got early. I went down to the White Sox dugout. And as they were finishing their practice and they were going back to their clubhouse, I found Nellie Fox. Now, Nellie Fox was the second baseman for the White Sox. And because somehow I couldn't see her, I missed Aparicio. So I handed him the poem and said, "Would you give this to Louis Aparicio?" So I watch him go down towards the clubhouse and he throws it out in a garbage where I,
Oh, no.
oh yeah, oh
So
no.
that's when you became a Cubs fan.
That's when I decided, okay, enough of this. And so,
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah.
yeah, I would still go occasionally to White Sox games because they were actually a pretty good team and they used to play the New York Yankees quite a bit. And the Yankees had great baseball players. So if you want to see Mickey Mantle in person, for
Yeah.
example, you really had to go to the game in Comiskey Park because there wasn't interleague play really. So anyway, I became a
But
Cubs fan.
I just want to mention, I had Pascal Mollenbergs. Do you know him? He's done a lot of work on group identity and doing FM functional brain imaging and stuff and
Yeah.
trying to figure out the networks there. Okay, so let's progress there. So far you've
So we did this
that's
functional imaging study. We had other findings from it that were interesting, most of them showing the importance of the frontal lobes in general and the prefrontal cortex, particularly in coordinating the activity of other areas of the brain that we didn't think were so involved in conceptual aspects or reasoning aspects of religious behavior. So we did those studies. And we were going then to bring back our Vietnam vets, who I had seen way back in the beginning of my career.
oh,
Now we were going to bring them back for what we called phase four. And this was after Demetrius Kapagianis, who was my fellow, went to you actually,
yeah.
went to your lab at the National Institute of Aging. So we coordinated with some religious scholars and a couple of other researchers to get scales, ways of measuring religious behavior.
Yeah, that's
And we
important.
decided to administer them to our Vietnam vets when they came through, which we did. And they were wondering, why are we asking them all these questions about God and mysticism and religious behavior? But we explained it to them. We were honest and clear and said we think brain areas are important for modulating this. And if you have damage to certain brain areas, maybe an aspect of your belief changes.
Yeah.
And so we were not, this was not personal. We just wanted to see across people what areas of the brain might be important. So almost everybody who came in agreed to do these scales. So they're very loyal. These Vietnam vets basically said, if this can help other vets in the future who've had traumatic brain injuries, we're in. we're in with you. And we did our best to help them as well because they often had difficulty with the VA and other entities in getting certain benefits, et cetera. So we were committed to them as well, the best we could be. So they came in, they did this, and now over the last 10 to 15 years, we've started doing studying uh, of these responses that they gave us with a simple technique called lesion mapping. So, as opposed to functional neuroimaging, where you're looking for brain activity that's correlated or associated with behavior, in lesion mapping, you're really looking to say that damage to that region was really important because it causally changes somebody's behavior or performance. So it
Yeah.
provides what we would say is convert. It's not superior, but it provides convergent evidence. And in our case, we want all kinds of evidence that we can bring to bear on these questions of religious belief in the human brain. And we thought, well, another way to study this is everything that we understand and know about religion is in our brains. And so what a convenient place to go. You know, as I always tell people, I sort of this is going to sound a little cheap, but it's true that I know God exists in the brain.
Right.
God exists in the brain, and therefore, God and everything else in fact, in the brains of atheists too. So way back when we did those first studies with Demetrius, we saw that the pattern of activity, by and large, was similar in atheists and people who had religious beliefs. So we all arguing that we all draw upon the representations to some degree with obvious differences because our belief systems slightly different are different between atheists, agnostics, and people who have various kinds of religious belief. I should add, and you haven't asked this yet, but I'm sure you would, is when we're talking about religious belief, there are very many religious communities. So who are we studying? By and large, we're in the United States, right? And
Yeah.
the majority of people in the United States are Christians.
Yeah.
So, in general, we tend to study people who have Christian beliefs, with a smaller number of people who are Muslim, Jewish, or Hindu, for example. Those are the primary religions that we would have access to. But most of the findings that we've had are related to Christian beliefs
Yeah.
by and large.
Yeah.
So we did these studies, and I think the results more or less are consistent with our prior conceptions of the importance of uh,
Prefrontal.
frontal lobes
Yeah.
for religious belief. Now, let me pause for a second here and remind your listeners that the frontal lobes are one of the last areas of the brain to mature. So in our experience, in children, they expand at a relatively rapid rate, a disproportional rate to some degree to other areas of the brain, although other areas follow along because we would argue that the frontal lobes are sort of the dominant region and therefore they instruct the rest of the brain as to what they better keep up with, including religious beliefs. So other areas of the brain contribute, but it was really the frontal lobe. So why did I bring up development? Well, really they grow and they grow more or less until early teenage years. And then we prune them, right? We start pruning the connectivity within the prefrontal cortex. Now, why do we prune that? Well, think about it when you're a kid, if you're a listener, you want to try everything. Everything's a go until something hurts you or you make a mistake and then you try to correct it. So that really starts to happen more or less when you get into high school, middle school to high school. And therefore, you want to accommodate the social milieu there to be accepted by your social group. And when you're doing that, you're narrowing down the kind of social behaviors that are acceptable to your social groups, including religious behavior. That pruning, though, lasts up until the mid 20s at least, that kind of pruning, until you have sort of your adult brain. That also suggests, and you were bringing this up before, Mark, that even though your beliefs are influenced by your family, your parents, and in some cases, particularly your father, like political beliefs tend to, if you have political beliefs, they tend to be the beliefs of your father, not your mother, in general. Okay, so what happens after high school? You go to college, and anybody, not everybody goes, but at college, or you start a job and you hang out with friends, and that is a time when your discussion with friends often borders on the philosophical. You know, what's important? Does this really exist, etc. And so for many people, that's a time of change of beliefs as well. So some people who didn't believe may wind up believing deeply after those discussions, looking for ways to guide their behavior, the way to structure their life to some degree. Other people reject that and they say, no, I'm not gonna, I don't want to behave like my parents did. I want to do something different. I want to have my own identity and character, even if I'm within social groups that are similar or dissimilar from the ones that I saw my parents were in. Okay, so that's the framework about how religious beliefs might develop dependent upon your age and your experience. I,
That's
yeah, go
that's
ahead.
interesting, Jordan. So my son in his high school, he had this one course that was kind of a philosophy and neuroscience combined, and the students, it was a small group, they got to choose what they wanted to read. So I think, the descent of Charles Darwin's The Descent of Man, uh, the New Testament. I don't think they read the Old Testament of the Bible, and they read some philosophy stuff and so on, and then discussed it among themselves. And so that I thought that was kind of a neat course at a time when these frontal cortex circuits are being refined and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate these days about teaching religion in public schools. And for example, in Texas right now, they're establishing, I don't know if it's a law, but at least an agreement that within every public school, the Ten Commandments will
Yeah.
be shown. Now, sometimes some people might recoil to that, say, for example, if you're Hindu, they don't have the Ten Commandments as they've been described in the
Right.
Old Testament and then practiced by people who believe in the New Testament. It's not really there for Hindus. They have their own belief systems, and there's a lot of overlap to some degree with the moral principles of Judaism or Christianity, for example, and the same for Islam. Okay, so you have that. And then, like we just talked about, you have this incredible history of how religion and politics influence human history and human evolution. Of course, you ought to teach that. You ought to teach that just like you might teach US history or world history
Yeah.
in public schools. I don't see any problem with teaching that as historical features of human evolution. I really don't see a problem in that. As a matter of fact, it'd be really important because it would help people understand the historical basis of these texts that some people would take as literal, other people would take as symbolic, other people would take as fictional to some degree. So I think it's important to learn and know about that. I bring up the developmental issue if for no other reason to say that the people we tend to study are adult,
Yeah.
mostly males, but not exclusively males. When we do neuroimaging, it's females and males. But in our lesion mapping studies, it's exclusively males, combat veterans,
Yeah.
and some with penetrating brain injuries, some without. So, in fact, in our case, we're even more confident of the studies that we've done with the Vietnam vets because they come from all parts of the country with all kinds of education, all kinds of employments. They're just really a nice cut of people. Whereas when you do neuroimaging, you're often recruiting college students or elitist people who learn about your studies and want to contribute. That's not always the case, but that tends to be the case. So again, we have convergence between highly educated people who do our neuroimaging studies and people from a wider range of backgrounds who contribute to our lesion mapping studies.
Do you want to so far you've talked about the prefrontal cortex as well, maybe I should say two things. We need to say what's generally agreed upon as some of the major functions of the prefrontal cortex: decision making, goal-directed behavior,
Foresight.
impulse control.
That's right. Impulse control mostly because it gives us, we represent potential behaviors there, right? Not all of which have occurred yet. And putting things out into time, into the future, often helps us inhibit
Yes.
are the kinds of behaviors we see in the world around us that are quite attractive in some way. They attract sort of more primitive behaviors that we want to control. We don't want to say something stupid. We don't want to make a stupid gesture of some kind. We want to control ourselves enough that we look appealing to somebody else or to a social group. The frontal lobe really helps us do that in the social sphere, but also, like you were saying, because we have all these kinds of representations that are complex in our frontal lobes, they also help us in many ways reason, make decisions, influence our decision making. It's explicitly sometimes, often implicitly, where especially if we make fast decisions, they can be influenced by those representations.
Yeah, so the prefrontal cortex, because there's kind of trade-off between like an immediate rewarding or pleasure versus, uh, you know, what's good for you and maybe whoever you're interacting with in the long term.
Yeah, it's not always the best way to think about something. So, for example,
Mm.
say you're listening to this podcast from New York City and you're on a subway platform and somebody pushes somebody else in front of a
Mm.
subway train. Well, you don't want to really reason out what you're going to do there.
Yeah,
Act fast, real fast.
yeah,
So this is based on sort of well-stored moral behaviors, things that you think are crucial,
yeah,
where you in some sense you may be sacrificing yourself when you do this, right?
yeah,
Uh, if you're going to jump in there, your life is at risk, not only the person that fell there or was pushed. So it works both ways.
yeah,
General, in the long run, for a larger group, the frontal lobe is critical. I think it's critical because of reasoning, importance in decision making, appropriate social behaviors. The list goes on. It's really a great. Well, if you want to understand who we are as people, that's the place to go.
yeah,
If you're interested in the brain in general and how it evolved, there are many areas to look at, including the brainstem. But it's a lot harder to look at brainstem regions and human activity or lesions. If you have a lesion in the brainstem, you're lucky if you're alive. Uh,
yeah. So Jordan, let's go through it and dig in a little bit deeper.
sure,
I kind of wrote down, I'm looking at it, my my crib notes here, and let's go through some of the lesion studies and get a little more into the prefrontal cortex is there's different circuits in the prefrontal cortex, and they seem to have different but interrelated functions. So
sure.
I think one of your first lesion studies with these Vietnam vets was you looked at, or maybe not, was fundamentalism.
That's right.
Yeah,
So one of the ways we think about the frontal lobes are that the medial, the center part of the frontal lobe, if you're looking on the podcast, I'm holding my hand right down the center of my skull on the top. That's medial. And if you go back to motor structures, just simply making movements, repetitive, overlearned movements tend to be stored medially in the center of the brain. And so we extrapolated from that and said, well, that's probably the same for other kinds of representations. Well rehearsed, well practiced behaviors are more likely to be stored medially than laterally along the sides. Now, it turns out that most of us want routine behaviors, right? We like the idea of routine behaviors. It calms us. It makes things more predictable. You have less anxiety. And so it makes a lot of sense then for humans to have sort of, let's call them broadly, fundamental behaviors, fundamental to us.
Yeah.
These are the ways we behave in general. And then when we're in novel situations, which are the majority really, everything's a little novel. Even if you take the same path to work every day, you're still going to see things that are different each time you go out on your way to work. That is more lateral areas of the brain storing all these particular experiences, some of which can be quite influential, others not so influential. They seem irrelevant, but we process them anyway in case there's something we want to extract from them that's going to be useful for us. So there's a lot more representations of these rarer experiences, but they're useful. So that's medial, routines, lateral, less routine. Then on top of that, we have ventral prefrontal cortex, the lower part of the frontal lobes. And that area of the brain is really concerned with emotion, rewards, and scaling things. All of us, my favorite team, the Chicago Cubs, right? Let me make sure I get that. Yeah. So that's my favorite team. The team I like the least, the New York Mets. Why? Because in 1969 they came from far behind and beat the Cubs, and I had relatives in New York who were laughing at me after we went to a particular Cubs game in September when the Mets came from behind to beat the Cubs. So that's remained in my, but I can scale it. And the emotions concerned with that scaling and value are ventral, lower parts of the brain, of the front in the frontal lobes of the brain. And less emotions are more superior in the prefrontal cortex. These are things that we might say are not devoid necessarily of emotional content, but the emotional content is lessened. Now, some of these areas, for example, the polar area, the very front part of the prefrontal cortex, seems to be quite important for allowing you to think through things. That is, you're not only retrieving the kinds of conceptual ideas that we have in the prefrontal cortex, but you're musing about them in various ways. And even that musing is a representation. How do you think about things is represented in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so the polar cortex is doing that as well. All right, so now you get a sense that it's a pretty complicated space.
Yeah.
And even within the frontal lobe, let's just say beliefs. So now we have all kinds of beliefs. We have political beliefs, we have economic beliefs, we have beliefs about how other people behave, we have religious beliefs. And so it's in our view, the prefrontal cortex medial structures are very much involved with representing these fundamentalist
Yeah.
beliefs.
Makes sense.
And it's not only fundamentalist religious beliefs, though. It could be fundamentalist political beliefs. If you have fundamental political beliefs, which you don't want to see change too much, that you could call yourself a conservative. Is there a relationship between fundamentalism and political conservatism? Yes, there is. And so these beliefs, you can argue, hang out with each other. Now, why is that interesting? This is one good reason to study the brain and religion, because now we can see at a network level within an area of the brain, potentially, we can see what I mean by that is we can study the relationship of one kind of belief system to another kind of belief system and how they influence each other, sometimes out of our awareness.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
that's really important to understand in terms of how our brain works in general. And it's also important to understand what makes us human.
This,
Mark, I
yeah,
want to say
I
one
had
more
one,
thing.
I had one, what?
Before you ask, let me say one more thing. I know I get excited about this, so I'm going on and on.
Yeah.
You got to interrupt me and stop.
Okay, I will. I'm good. I'm actually good at that.
Okay.
Um, a couple things. First, so some of these people, after they've had the brain injury, their level of religiosity or fundamentalism changes,
It can change.
like one way or the other. Isn't that one way you can
That's right.
get a kind of cause effect or
You can. You can, and so what might happen if you have damage to say, for example, I'll give you an example. I can't mention the people here where I got the referrals, but I got referrals from closed traumatic brain injuries cases,
okay.
a few of them. And in this case, with closed traumatic brain injury, often the connectivity between regions within the frontal lobe are damaged and affected, and maybe even some regions within the frontal lobe are affected. These cases, they came to me because they lost their religious belief. And in a couple of cases, they had prominent positions within their religious order.
Huh.
And right after the traumatic brain injury, they changed.
So
Now,
is this damage to the axon bundles that are
exactly.
connecting right, that connect the different brain regions?
That's almost always a piece of even mild, but certainly moderate to severe traumatic brain injury, along with local damage to the gray matter, to the neurons themselves. That
But is it so that connections between the left and right side of the brain could be a
right.
problem or
Right.
yeah,
So at least there's a couple of bundles of fibers
yeah.
that seem to be highly susceptible to traumatic brain injuries of the kind that we hear about from car accidents or falls. One of them is, as you mentioned, the bundles between the left and the right side of the brain, often called the corpus callosum.
Yeah.
Bundles can be sheared, torn, or at least modestly damaged. There is another set of structures uh, that are concerned with emotions. One name is the amygdala.
Mhm.
That's in the front part of the temporal lobes. The amygdala, another it's a word that really is almond. It comes from almond. And so that's in the front of the temporal lobes, and there's connections between that structure that is definitely concerned with emotion and relevance and labeling of things we're experiencing into the frontal lobes. So you can also have dissociations between emotions and reason based on traumatic brain injury, especially the more severe injuries.
And anger, a traumatic effect on anger is a consequence of brain injuries.
Yes, we published on that with our Vietnam vets as well. And we got not only a self-report, but the ratings from their caregivers on this. And it's very clear that people become much more aggressive and angry, especially with a fair amount of frontal lobe injuries. And that's just not something that you see in a lab. That affects the family, the relationships within the family, really affects the children. And so it's quite significant. And so this
And was there any, these individuals that were, high up in their church, local church or whatever, and they had the injury and then they were no longer religious. Did they have a change in their level of empathy?
ah right.
Because these religious leaders, at least face to face with people, right? They show a lot of empathy. That's kind of their job.
Right, right. Well, it's all it's a job
Well,
for
no,
all of
I
us,
know, but
isn't it?
I
I,
don't know. Scientists, we're having a pleasant conversation, but if I was working on something close to what you're doing and I had a different result,
but that's a lesson, isn't it? I
yeah,
like that. It teaches me, so
yeah,
I don't
that's right.
mind that. But
That's
other people might find it threatening. There's no doubt about that. But you bring up an important point, and we have a recent finding that we're writing up a paper, for example, that shows that you, and this is a lesion mapping study that looks at emotional processing and feeling close to God. And your basic emotional processing skills are not related to how close you feel to God. We
oh,
couldn't find that. So you can be very skilled at reading the emotions of others, but that's not going to do it. But what does do it? Empathy. So we know that if you're empathetic, you have a much stronger relationship to God. So we can see that in our findings.
and is that empathy for in-group and out-group people? Because
uh,
there's this, and this is not science that I'm going to say now, and it is that these very right-leaning religious fundamentalists seem to have less empathy for the out-group, or even, it seems, and I don't know, that's just perceptions of what I'm seeing going on in the world right now.
Sure. I think there's certainly a degree of truth in that if you have fundamentalist beliefs, as we talked about before, you don't necessarily want to see them challenged,
Yeah.
right? And you're fearful, the amygdala, right, is going to be active then. You're a little bit fearful of having to modify those beliefs via experience. And so you're resistant to doing that. And there are brain structures that support that resistance. So much so, and this would be the case in politics and religion, if you're simply reading something that is at odds with your belief system, simply reading something, it activates the amygdala because it upsets you. And vice versa. If you're reading something that supports your belief system, it can also activate the amygdala and other emotional structures uh, to further enhance that belief system to make it stronger.
And maybe activate the dopaminergic, the
Abs- Absolutely.
nucleus accumbens.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we're doing studies now in collaboration with a group in Toronto using a technique called low intensity focused ultrasound
Ah,
because we believe, and they have some evidence now, that it can stimulate deeper structures directly without having the degree of activation cortically that you might see from, say, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is on the surface of the scalp into the cortex. This goes deeper. And so it looks like we're able to target the nucleus accumbens and the reward system. And just like any behavior that where you feel you've achieved something, and that includes formulating your religious belief, it's going to activate the reward system,
yeah.
including the nucleus accumbens and the frontal lobe.
Now the brain stimulation, yeah, that's really the next step, isn't it? The question is, can you affect, I guess, almost in real time, someone's level of religiosity or closeness to God uh, by stimulating or inhibiting, and now you have a good idea which circuits you want to focus on.
Yeah. So I think you can do that up to a point
Yeah.
because there's no God spot. We
No.
can't find a God spot.
Yeah.
We looked and we continue to look, but we can't find it. So your representation of your beliefs is embedded in networks that are concerned with other beliefs. And so when you stimulate those regions, you're not simply stimulating a religious belief. Now, however, if you pair up the stimulation while somebody's doing something related to religious belief, you can potentially affect that form of belief in some way. But it's usually temporary and it's reversible. And that's the idea behind a lot of the research using non-invasive brain stimulation. So it's another way. That, along with lesion mapping and functional neuroimaging, is a way to get at convergence for these structures. But no doubt, when you have your beliefs well entrenched and confirmed by your experiences, that activates your reward system, which then further reinforces that belief.
Yeah.
And that reward system gets up into the prefrontal cortex from the brainstem, and is the dopaminergic system, as you pointed out.
Now you collaborated with a guy Michael Ferguson at he's at
That's
Harvard.
right.
I guess he's got a Mormon background, and one of the studies was pretty interesting where you're trying to map religious, well, that's the most recent one, religious fundamentalism to particular brain region. And was that the one, or was it another one?
Yeah.
Anyway,
So,
one of them, the conclusion ended up that if there's damage to brain regions that are connected to the periaqueductal gray, which is a very old part of the brain that's seems to mediate a lot of things, but one thing that mediates actually pain, and but another is I think at least in animals, maternal bonding of a mother with a child, offspring. So there you have that bonding thing, bonding with a imaginary entity, a god, and then the pain thing is, I don't know,
well,
maybe
the idea is it
being
relieves.
punished if you do something wrong, if you
Ah,
don't.
that's what that's one point of view, Mark. That's right. I mean, it could be if you disobey
Yeah,
a rule, a religious rule, it could offer increased pain. But there's the opposite side. That is, if you have a strong belief, it can help suppress pain.
suppressed pain. Yeah.
And actually,
Ah,
there's a lot of studies on that in terms of beliefs helping you manage
yeah, that's
health crises
yes.
in many ways. And so I think what you've pointed out also is that even though I've been talking about specific brain regions in the frontal lobes of the brain, that our studies with Michael and Michael Fox up at Harvard have been involved with identifying networks,
Yeah,
not simply single or a few regions, but a
yeah,
whole network. And the connectivity, which you pointed out, often extends into brainstem regions. It's a network.
yeah.
And we really do like these kinds of studies, but they do have all these studies have their limitations in terms of once you study a network, you have to figure out what all the nodes in the network are doing in combination so that that network operates. And way back when we first started doing our studies with Demetrius, it was very clear, Capagianis, it was very clear that the frontal lobe was often the boss of the network. That is, it really guided, unless there was a crisis or something really unexpected in the environment that drew your attention, where it required sensory processing, that in general, our guidance of our behaviors is prefrontal and influences even brainstem mechanisms. But I've gotten so interested in this now, in some ways, that we're now trying to study the vagus nerve and
Oh,
and and vagal nerve processing and
huh.
how it helps manipulate networks in the brain.
Oh, very interesting. I had a podcast on vagus nerve with uh oh my gosh, what the heck's his name? Tracy, this guy he's doing a lot uh immune
Oh, Kevin Tracy.
Kevin Tracy, yeah, yeah.
He's a
A
neurosurgeon, I think.
couple things. I know you have to leave in about 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. First thing, decision making. Um, and this is kind of a practical question. Okay, so our country has a separation of church and state. And my reading of the history and Jefferson and Ben Franklin and so on is the reason this was set up to prevent, uh, one religion from controlling the country, to prevent, I think, decision making based on religious doctrine and not on evidence-based decision making. So what about decision making in people who are highly religious, so have a high level of
Well, you mentioned previously that you had some conversations with Francis Collins,
yes,
who has strong religious beliefs,
yeah,
but probably there wouldn't be a strong argument that he was a poor decision maker. I mean, you can
no,
argue, we all make difficult decisions, some
yeah,
of which are not the best.
yeah,
But in general, here's somebody who makes pretty good decisions. So it's not simply an issue of decision making being affected by religious belief. I think that, but religious belief does influence our decisions. Like you pointed out just now, many of the founders of our country, their ancestors fled Europe
yeah,
because of religious persecution
yeah,
and came to this country to have more freedom of belief.
yeah,
But it was very clear, I think, to them that they did not want to have the same situation occur in America that occurred in Europe. And so the best way to avoid that, as you pointed out, was to separate out church and state
yeah.
for very good reasons.
Okay, last thing. So I'm gonna, in the description section to this on the YouTube channel and the other audio outlets, I'm gonna put in links to your maybe a couple of your papers, but this recent review article you wrote with Patrick McNamara, which I thought was really fantastic, in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, and there you kind of developed this triple network tripartite model, that's relevant to religiosity, mystical experiences, but also to actually some psychiatric disorders, I think. Could you briefly, what are the three networks and how do they control each other?
Well, it's a homeostasis,
Yeah,
right? I mean, it's sort of a balance between belief, emotion, and cognition, sort of operations on these beliefs and how we manage our emotions. So they're all supposed to work together. I will say that I've been working with Patrick now for the last few years on a project funded by the Templeton Foundation
oh yeah,
that has allowed us. So I'm going to give a plug for some of our more recent research, which is unpublished to some degree, about to get published, partly on attachment. Is the relationship between how we attach ourselves to God and how we attach ourselves to, for example, parents? Is it the same kind of attachments?
hmm,
So that's one thing we're doing. That's an outgrowth of my collaboration with Patrick. Another area that we're interested in is dreaming, because in the Bible, both the Old Testament in particular, but also the New Testament, much of the word that comes from God comes through people in their dreams. That is, God, they've seen God in their dreams, they heard prophecies in their dreams, and now they're going to express it to other people. So the importance of dreaming to religious belief, we think is quite critical. And then lastly,
hmm,
one of the reasons I've become interested in supernatural agents and miracles now, I'm very interested in miracles and the report of miracles, is because those seem to be what I would call the big ticket items to get you into a religion. If there are no miracles and there are no supernatural agents, more or less you don't have a religion. You can have meditative states, that's fine, but that's not a religion.
Yeah.
That's just a way of achieving another state. So miracles and how they're represented in the brain, along with supernatural agents, is going to be the kinds of research we're doing moving into the future. So models of religious belief, like in the paper you saw by Patrick and myself, but also there's a Nature opinion piece that we publish in the journal Nature
Oh,
that
yes.
we published last year.
Oh,
Uh, Also points out what some of the challenges have been to studying the brain basis of religious belief. And that extends not only from dreams and brain injuries and functional imaging, but even into the use of psychedelics
yeah.
to evoke spiritual experiences under the experience of
It'll
psychedelics.
be very interesting to see how that ongoing work and the work with psychedelics. Roland Griffiths at Hopkins has been doing a lot of that
That's
work.
right.
Okay, well, thanks for taking the time, Jordan. I enjoyed meeting you and talking to you, and go Cubs. They're doing okay so far this year.
Yeah, this year's all right. I have my belief systems are in high gear
Okay,
for the postseason. So,
all right. Take care. Enjoy the summer.
all right. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. I appreciate it.
Okay, goodbye.
All righty. Bye now.